Sometimes a father's debt costs more than money. It costs a daughter's freedom. Sometimes running away is the only choice left when staying means losing your soul. Brynja fled into the frozen forest rather than marry the cruel chieftain who owned her father's debt. She found an old hunting hut and survived on snow and roots, choosing hunger over horror. Then a giant Viking found her. Stigvar was a former warrior who lived alone in the woods. He could have claimed the reward for returning her. Instead, he brought her food and warm furs. Day by day, trust grew between them, but the chieftain wanted his prize back and sent armed men to get her. Now Stigvar faces a choice between the peaceful life he built and the violence he left behind. What happens when a man who renounced war must fight to save the woman who gave him peace? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silver armband gleamed against Eric's thick forearm as he examined the parchment one final time. 3 harvests of debt sealed with Gunnar's desperate mark. The chieftain's pale eyes held no warmth as he rolled the document and tucked it into his belt. In the smoky confines of his great hall, surrounded by the wealth torn from a dozen conquered settlements, he smiled the way wolves smile before they feed. "Tell me again about the daughter," Eric commanded his steward. A weasel-faced man named Hakon, who had perfected the art of delivering bad news with pleasure. "Brynja, my lord. 20 summers unmarried, hair like spun gold, and eyes the color of summer sky. Her father claims she reads the old runes and knows the healing herbs." Hakon's tongue darted across his lips. "She would be a fine addition to your household." Eric's collection of wives and concubines already numbered 7, but none had given him the son he craved. Perhaps this farm girl carried different fortune in her womb. Besides, there was something particularly satisfying about plucking beauty from poverty, about watching hope die in innocent eyes. 3 days' ride from the chieftain's hall, Brynja knelt in the black earth of her family's struggling farm, her hands working automatically to harvest the last of the root vegetables before the hard frost claimed them. Her back ached from the endless bending, but she welcomed the honest pain. Physical discomfort was simple, manageable, unlike the dread that had settled in her chest like a stone since her father's confession 2 nights ago. "The debt must be paid," Gunnar had said, his weathered hands shaking as he stared into the dying fire. 3 years of failed harvests, and now the winter stores are too thin. Eric offers forgiveness in exchange for... His voice had cracked like old leather. "In exchange for me," Brynja had finished, the words tasting like ash. She had seen the chieftains' wives at the seasonal gatherings, pale shadows who flinched at loud noises and spoke in whispers. The lucky ones died in childbirth. The others simply faded until death claimed them out of mercy. Now she worked her fingers raw in the cold earth, trying not to think about tomorrow when Eric's men would come to collect what their master considered his due. Around her, the familiar landscape of her childhood took on the quality of a farewell. The weathered barn where she had learned to milk goats, the well where her mother had taught her to draw clean water without disturbing the sediment, the small garden plot where healing herbs grew in careful rows. Her mother Astrid had been the village healer before the fever took her 3 winters past. "Remember," she had whispered with her last breath, "sometimes the bravest thing a woman can do is choose her own path, even when the world tries to choose for her." At the time, Brynja had thought her mother spoke of healing work, of choosing to help others despite the risks. Now she understood the deeper truth buried in those words. The cottage door creaked as her father emerged, moving like a man who had aged decades in days. Once Gunnar had been a proud farmer who could plough a field from dawn to dusk without stopping. The failed harvests had broken more than his back, they had broken his spirit. Now he looked at his daughter with eyes full of shame and desperate hope, as if she might somehow forgive him for selling her future to buy their survival. "The porridge is ready," he said quietly, unable to meet her gaze. Inside the small, dim cottage, they ate in silence. The thin gruel, stretched with too much water, spoke of the lean times that had driven them to this desperate bargain. Brynja's portion sat untouched in her bowl. Tomorrow she would eat at Eric's table, wear fine cloth that smelled of other women's fears, and sleep in a bed that felt more like a grave. "I could run," she said suddenly, the words spilling out before she could stop them. Her father's spoon clattered against his bowl. "Where, to what? A woman alone in winter?" He shook his head violently. "At least with Eric you'll be fed, sheltered. Perhaps in time I'll be another ghost haunting his hall." Brynja pushed back from the table. "I've seen his wives, father. I've seen what becomes of his beautiful things." The old man's shoulders sagged further. "The debt collectors will come for the farm if I cannot pay. They'll take everything, the land, the animals, the cottage. At least this way, something of our family survives." But what survived would not be her, Brynja thought as she lay sleepless on her straw mattress that night. Outside, the wind moaned through the bare branches, like lost souls seeking rest they would never find. She thought of her mother's words, of choosing her own path. The chieftain's silver armband represented chains as surely as if they were forged of iron. But somewhere in the vast forest that stretched beyond their farm, there might still be freedom to choose death over dishonor. The village itself reflected the hard times that had driven so many families to desperate measures. Once prosperous homesteads stood empty, their owners claimed by debt or disease, or the endless raids that followed poor harvests. The survivors gathered in Olaf's alehouse spoke in hushed tones of the terrible bargains they had made to see another spring. Daughters sold, sons sworn to brutal service, family lands signed away for a winter's worth of grain. Eric ruled through fear and necessity. When people had nothing left to lose, he provided just enough hope to keep them obedient. A reprieve from debt here, a small mercy there, always with the understanding that his generosity came with a price that would be collected in full. His hall stood like a malignant growth at the village center, its carved pillars and painted shields a stark reminder of the wealth that could be achieved through ruthless ambition. The chieftain had built his power through a combination of strategic marriages, brutal raids, and an uncanny ability to survive battles that claimed better men. Unlike the old heroes who won loyalty through courage and honor, Eric commanded through fear and debt. He understood that hungry people would do anything for bread, and desperate fathers would sacrifice anything for their family's survival. His steward, Hakon, had perfected the art of collecting these debts with maximum humiliation. He arrived at failing farms with a small army of witnesses, making certain that every neighbor understood the consequences of crossing the chieftain. The ceremonies were always public, always designed to strip away the last vestiges of dignity, along with whatever payment was extracted. Tomorrow would be Brynja's turn to learn what it meant to be owned by Eirik Grimson. But tonight, as she listened to her father's restless sleep and felt the weight of her mother's memory, she made a choice that would change everything. Sometimes the bravest thing a woman could do was refuse to let others write her ending. In the pre-dawn darkness, she rose silently and dressed in her warmest clothes. Her mother's small knife found its way into her belt, along with a leather pouch containing the last of the healing herbs. She took nothing else, no food, no extra clothing, nothing that might be missed before her absence was discovered. At the cottage door, she paused to look back at her sleeping father one last time. "I choose my own path," she whispered to the darkness. Then she stepped into the frozen forest and disappeared like morning mist before the sun. The frozen forest swallowed Brynja's footsteps as she stumbled deeper into the wilderness. Behind her, the familiar outline of her father's farm faded into darkness, taking with it the last traces of the life she had known. Each step forward was a step away from everything safe and certain, but also a step away from the silver chains that would have bound her to Eric's cruel will. The ancient pine trees loomed overhead like silent guardians, their branches heavy with snow that muffled all sound except her labored breathing. The cold bit through her woolen cloak, finding every gap in her clothing to remind her that winter showed no mercy to the unprepared. Her feet, wrapped only in leather shoes meant for farm work, already felt numb against the frozen ground. She had no plan beyond escape, no destination except away. The forest stretched for countless leagues in every direction, home to wolves and worse things, but even death by fang or claw seemed preferable to the slow destruction that awaited her in Irik's hall. At least here, her fate remained her own to choose. The morning sun climbed slowly through the canopy, casting long shadows that shifted and danced like living things. Brynja's stomach cramped with hunger, but she pushed forward, following what might have been a deer path winding deeper into the woods. Every sound made her freeze: the crack of a branch, the rustle of something moving through the underbrush, the distant cry of a hunting bird. Any of these could signal pursuit, could mean that Hakon's men had already discovered her absence and begun the hunt. By midday, exhaustion forced her to rest against the massive trunk of an old oak. Her hands shook as she pulled her cloak tighter, trying to conserve what little warmth remained in her body. The reality of her situation began to settle in like the cold itself, slow, inexorable, deadly. She had perhaps 2 days before hunger weakened her beyond recovery. Less if the weather turned worse, but as she sat shivering against the oak, something caught her eye through the trees ahead. A structure, man-made and weathered, barely visible through the snow-laden branches. Hope flared in her chest as she struggled to her feet and stumbled toward what might be shelter. The hunting lodge emerged from the forest like something from a half-remembered dream. Built of stout logs and roofed with sod, it had clearly stood empty for seasons. Wild vines crawled up its walls, and one shutter hung askew, but the bones of the structure remained sound. More importantly, the heavy wooden door still held against the weather. Inside, weak sunlight filtered through gaps in the shutters, illuminating a single room dominated by a stone hearth. Rough-hewn furniture, a table, 2 chairs, a sleeping platform built into one wall, spoke of a hunter's practical needs. Animal skins, stiff with age and cold, covered the floor and sleeping area. Everything smelled of disuse and abandonment, but to Brynja it represented salvation. She set about making the place livable with the efficiency her mother had taught her. The hearth's chimney drew properly when she cleared away debris and dead leaves. Outside, she gathered fallen branches and pine needles for kindling. Her mother's flint and steel, carried out of habit rather than foresight, sparked to life in her numb fingers. Soon a small fire crackled in the hearth, driving back the worst of the cold and filling the lodge with dancing light. Brynja melted snow in a wooden bowl she found on the table, drinking the lukewarm water greedily. Her stomach gnawed at itself, reminding her that warmth alone would not keep her alive. But for the moment, she allowed herself to feel something approaching hope. The hunting lodge held other treasures. A cache of dried meat wrapped in oiled leather, hidden beneath loose stones near the hearth. The meat was tough and oversalted, clearly preserved for emergency use, but it tasted like the finest feast to her empty stomach. She ate sparingly, knowing the supply was limited, but even those few bites gave her strength to think clearly for the first time since her flight began. As evening approached, she barricaded the door and shuttered the windows completely, not daring to let firelight show through cracks that might guide pursuers to her hiding place. In the flickering shadows, she took inventory of her situation with the practical mind her mother had cultivated in her. The lodge could shelter her from the worst weather, and the hidden food stores might last a week if she was careful. After that, she pushed the thought away. One day at a time, her mother always said. Survive today, worry about tomorrow when it arrives. Sleep came fitfully, broken by every sound from the forest outside. Each creak of settling wood, each whisper of wind through the trees, might herald discovery and capture. But dawn brought only silence and the soft patter of fresh snow against the shutters. The second day established a pattern. Rise before dawn, tend the fire, melt snow for water, ration out a small portion of dried meat. Then the long hours of hiding, straining her ears for any sound that might mean danger. The solitude pressed against her like a physical weight, but she welcomed it. Alone, she answered to no one but herself. On the third morning, she woke to an ominous silence. The usual forest sounds, bird calls, the rustle of small animals, the whisper of wind through branches had ceased completely. Even experienced hunters knew that when the woods fell silent, something was wrong. Brynja crept to the window and peered through a gap in the shutters. At first, she saw nothing unusual, just the familiar landscape of snow-covered trees and shadows. Then movement caught her eye, a figure moving through the forest with purposeful stride, too large and deliberate to be anything but human. Her blood turned to ice water as she recognized the distinctive red cloak of Eric's men. They had found her trail somehow, followed it through the wilderness to her refuge. Panic flooded her system as she watched the figure approach, but she forced herself to remain still. Movement would betray her position as surely as if she had shouted her location. The warrior stopped 20 paces from the lodge, his head turning slowly as he studied the structure. Even at this distance, Brynja could see his predatory patience, the way he tested the air like a hunting wolf. He knew someone had been here recently. The thin smoke from her carefully banked fire, the traces of footprints in the snow, perhaps even her scent carried on the wind. He called out in a voice that carried clearly through the winter air. "I know you're in there, girl. Come out peacefully, and I'll tell the chieftain you caused no trouble. Make me drag you out, and your first night in his hall will be even worse than planned." Brynja's grip tightened on her mother's small knife. The blade would be useless against an armed warrior, but she would not be taken without a fight. If this was where her flight ended, she would at least face it on her feet. The warrior began moving toward the lodge with measured steps, his hand resting on his sword hilt. 20 paces became 15, then 10. At the door he paused, listening. Brynja held her breath until her lungs burned, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain he must hear it. Then the forest exploded into violence. A shadow fell across the warrior like the hand of death itself. Through the gap in the shutters, Brynja watched in stunned disbelief as a giant of a man materialized from between the trees with impossible silence. The newcomer stood nearly a head taller than Eric's warrior, his broad shoulders draped in rough fur that made him appear more beast than man. Long dark hair, streaked with premature gray, framed a face that spoke of countless battles and hard-won wisdom. The warrior spun toward this new threat, his sword clearing its sheath in one fluid motion. But the giant's massive hands were already in motion, empty yet somehow more dangerous than any blade. What followed was not a fight, but an execution of such swift brutality that Brynja barely registered the movements before it was over. The warrior's sword clattered harmlessly to the frozen ground. His body followed a heartbeat later, neck twisted at an unnatural angle, his red cloak spreading across the snow like spilled wine. The giant stood over the corpse for a moment, studying it with the dispassionate attention of a craftsman examining his work. Then those pale grey eyes turned toward the lodge, and Brynja's blood froze. She pressed herself against the wall beside the window, her mother's knife trembling in her grip. The killer moved toward the door with the same measured pace the dead warrior had used. But something in his bearing suggested patience rather than menace. "I know you're in there," he said, his voice a low rumble that carried no threat despite the words. "The dead man was hunting you. That makes you either very brave or very foolish." He paused at the threshold. "Either way, you'll freeze to death if you stay hidden much longer. The storm coming will bury this lodge under snow for days." Brynja remained silent, every instinct screaming warnings. This giant had just killed a man with his bare hands. What mercy could she expect from someone capable of such violence? "My name is Stigvar Ironson," the voice continued. "This is my winter lodge. I built it with these hands, and I return here each year when the snows grow deep." A longer pause. "The food you've been eating, I left it for exactly this purpose. Travelers lost in winter, people with nowhere else to go. You're welcome to it." The words made no sense. Why would a killer speak of hospitality? Why would someone capable of snapping necks like kindling leave food for strangers? Brynja's mind struggled to reconcile what she had witnessed with what she was hearing. "The warrior wore Eric Grimson's colors," Stigvar said, and something in his tone suggested familiarity with the chieftain's reputation. "Running from him was wise. Staying hidden from me is not." The heavy wooden door creaked under pressure. "This storm will last 3 days. We can weather it together like civilized people, or I can break down this door and drag you out like the savage you think I am. Your choice." Brynja closed her eyes, weighing impossible options. Stay hidden and possibly freeze when the storm hit, or trust a man who had just committed murder with terrifying ease. Neither choice offered safety, but at least the second left her fate in her own hands. Slowly, she moved to the door and lifted the heavy bar that held it closed. The portal swung open to reveal Stigvar in full detail, taller than any man she had ever seen, with shoulders that could carry tree trunks and hands that looked capable of crushing stone. But his grey eyes held something unexpected, a deep weariness that spoke of too much violence and too many hard choices. "You're smaller than I expected," he said, studying her with the same careful attention he had given the dead warrior. "Younger too. What could you have done to earn Eric's personal attention?" "My father owed him a debt," Brynja replied, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. 3 years of failed harvests. The payment was... She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "You," Stigvar completed, and she heard understanding in the single word. "Yes, that sounds like our ambitious chieftain. He collects beautiful things the way other men collect scars." His gaze moved past her, into the lodge. "You've made yourself comfortable. Good. That shows sense." He stepped past her into the lodge, and Brynja noticed how carefully he moved despite his size, like a man conscious of taking up too much space in the world. At the hearth, he knelt to examine her small fire with professional interest. "Well built," he said approvingly. "Your mother taught you craft." It was not a question somehow, but a statement of fact that left Brynja wondering what he could read in the arrangement of stones and kindling. "She was a healer," Brynja said, still clutching her knife, though she was beginning to doubt its usefulness. "She taught me many things before the fever took her." "Healers understand fire better than most," Stigvar agreed, adding larger logs to the flames with practiced efficiency. "Fire can burn away sickness, cauterize wounds, drive back the darkness. But it can also destroy everything you love if you're careless with it." He glanced at her meaningfully, much like running from powerful men. Outside, the first flakes of new snow began to fall, and the wind picked up enough to moan through the trees. Stigvar had been right about the coming storm. Already the light was fading as clouds gathered overhead, promising the kind of blizzard that could bury the lodge entirely. "What happens now?" Brynja asked, settling into one of the chairs but keeping her distance from the giant. "Now we wait for the storm to pass," Stigvar replied simply. "I have supplies cached here for exactly this situation. Food, furs, fuel for the fire. Enough for 2 people to survive comfortably for a week if necessary." He gestured toward the corner, where several leather bundles sat covered in dust. "After that, you make another choice about where your path leads." "And you?" Brynja found herself asking. "What path do you follow?" Something shifted in his expression, a shadow of old pain crossing his features. "I follow the path that leads away from who I used to be. Some days, that means living alone in the wilderness. Other days, it means helping lost girls escape cruel fates." His grey eyes met hers directly. "Today appears to be one of the second kind." The storm struck in earnest as evening fell, howling around the lodge with a fury that made the sturdy walls tremble. But inside, warmth and light held back the chaos. Stigvar proved as good as his word about the supplies, producing smoked fish, dried berries, even a small cask of ale that he mixed with hot water and honey to make a warming drink. They ate in relative silence, the stranger's presence both comforting and unsettling. He moved with the economy of motion that marked professional warriors, but he served her food with gentle courtesy that spoke of different training entirely. Everything about him seemed to contain contradictions, brutal efficiency paired with unexpected kindness, massive physical presence tempered by careful restraint. The storm raged for 2 full days, sealing them inside the lodge while wind-driven snow piled against the walls. Brynja learned that sharing close quarters with a giant required careful navigation, not because Stigvar showed any threatening behavior, but because his very presence filled the small space with an energy that was impossible to ignore. On the first morning, she woke to find him already tending the fire, adding logs with movements so quiet she had not stirred, despite sleeping on the hard wooden platform mere feet away. He had given her the furs and taken only his own cloak for covering, a courtesy that spoke of ingrained chivalry despite his fearsome reputation. "You were berserker," she said as they shared a breakfast of oatcakes and dried fruit. It was not a question. The signs were unmistakable to anyone who knew how to read them. The scars that marked his hands and forearms, the way his eyes tracked movement, even in the safety of the lodge, the controlled violence that had dispatched Eric's warrior with such casual efficiency. Stigvar paused, with his wooden spoon halfway to his mouth. "Once," he admitted, "in another life, when I believed the gods smiled on those who died gloriously in battle." His grey eyes grew distant. "I learned that the gods care little for glory, and less for the men who seek it through bloodshed. What changed your mind?" Brynja asked, genuinely curious. She had heard stories of berserkers who abandoned their violent calling, but most died young or continued fighting until age or injury claimed them. "A small farm," Stigvar said quietly. "A family caught between two raiding parties, trying to protect their children and livestock. I was leading one of those parties, drunk on battle fury and the promise of easy plunder." He set down his spoon, his appetite apparently gone. "When the madness cleared, I found myself standing over the body of a boy who could not have seen more than 12 winters. He had tried to defend his little sister with a wooden training sword. The silence that followed was heavy with old grief. Outside, the wind continued its assault on the lodge, but inside the only sounds were the crackle of flames and the soft whisper of their breathing. "What did you do?" Brynja asked softly. "I buried the boy with my own hands," Stigvar replied. "Then I walked away from my warband, my weapons, my sworn lord, everything that had defined my life until that moment. The gods can keep their glorious deaths. I chose to live with what I had done instead." Brynja studied his profile in the firelight, seeing the weight of years and choices in the lines around his eyes. "How long have you been alone?" 7 winters. Stigvar stirred the fire with a poker, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. "Long enough to learn that solitude has its own lessons to teach. Short enough to remember why I chose it. The second day brought a strange intimacy, born of shared space and honest conversation." Brynja found herself telling stories of her mother's healing work, of the village women who came seeking remedies for everything from difficult births to loveless marriages. Stigvar listened with the attention of a man who had learned to value words over action, asking thoughtful questions that revealed both intelligence and genuine interest. In return, he spoke of his wanderings through the northern forests, of the wildlife he had observed, and the changing seasons he had learned to read like a familiar book. He described wolf packs with the same careful attention he might once have given to enemy formations. But now his knowledge served protection rather than destruction. "The wolves are not evil," he explained, as they watched the storm through a gap in the shutters. "They hunt because they must eat. They defend their territory because they must survive. They do not kill for sport or glory, or because some jarl promises them treasure. In many ways, they are more honest than men. Is that why you chose to live among them rather than people?" Brynja asked. Stigvar considered the question seriously. "Wolves do not ask me to justify my past or promise them a different future. They accept what I am now, not what I was before. It is easier to find peace when you are not constantly explaining yourself to others. And yet you helped me," Brynja pointed out. "You could have left me to freeze or handed me over to Eric's man for whatever reward he offered." "Yes," Stigvar agreed simply. "I could have done either of those things. Why didn't you?" He was quiet for so long that Brynja thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested the admission cost him something, because 7 years ago, I failed to save a boy who reminded me that not everyone who suffers deserves their fate. Yesterday I found myself with a chance to save a woman who reminded me of the same truth." He met her eyes directly. Perhaps the gods do not smile on glory, but they sometimes offer opportunities for redemption. The conversation revealed something that Brynja had not expected. Beneath Stigvar's self-imposed exile lay not hatred of humanity, but a deep capacity for pain at human suffering. His isolation was not born of misanthropy, but of a conscience too sensitive to bear witness to cruelty without feeling compelled to act. That evening, as the storm finally began to weaken, they shared the lodge's small store of ale, while the wind died to a whisper outside the shutters. The alcohol loosened both their tongues, leading to stories that neither would have told in full sobriety. Brynja spoke of her mother's final illness, of holding vigil through long nights while fever consumed the woman who had been her anchor in an uncertain world. She described the moment when she realized that all her carefully learned healing arts could not save the person she loved most. "She made me promise not to let others choose my fate," Brynja said, staring into the dancing flames. She said that a woman's greatest weapon was her ability to say no to the wrong man, even when saying yes seemed safer. "Wise counsel," Stigvar observed. "Difficult to follow when the wrong man holds your father's debt." "I thought I would die in these woods," Brynja admitted. "Freeze or starve or be torn apart by wild animals. It seemed better than the alternative." "And now?" Stigvar asked quietly. Brynja looked around the small lodge that had become her refuge, at the man who had killed to protect her, and then offered warmth and shelter without asking for anything in return. "Now I think perhaps there are alternatives I had not considered." The third morning dawned clear and bitter cold, the storm having blown itself out during the night. Sunlight streamed through the gaps in the shutters, revealing a world transformed by snow that lay 3 feet deep against the lodge walls. Stigvar rose before dawn to dig out the door, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air as he carved a path to the woodpile and the small lean-to where he had stored additional supplies. Brynja watched him work through the window, noting how he moved with purpose despite the obvious difficulty of the task. Everything he did seemed calculated to ensure their comfort and safety, clearing paths for water and fuel, checking the chimney for ice blockages, testing the integrity of the roof where snow had accumulated in dangerous quantities. "We could stay here longer," she said when he returned inside, stamping snow from his boots. "Until spring, perhaps. Eric might assume I died in the storm and give up the search." Stigvar shook his head as he hung his ice-crusted cloak near the fire. "Eric Grimson does not give up what he considers his property. If one man fails to return, he will send 5. If those 5 disappear, he will come himself with 20. He added logs to the fire with practiced efficiency. "Besides, this lodge was never meant for permanent habitation. The food stores will not last beyond another week, and I have no desire to spend the rest of winter eating tree bark and snow." "Then where do we go?" Brynja asked, though she had been dreading this question since the storm began. The lodge represented safety and warmth, a place outside the normal world where neither her past nor Stigvar's seemed to matter. Leaving meant returning to the harsh realities that had driven them both into exile. "That depends on what you want your life to become," Stigvar replied, settling into the chair across from her. "You have choices now that you did not have 3 days ago. The question is whether you have the courage to claim them." Brynja frowned, confused by the suggestion that her options had somehow expanded. "What choices?" "I'm still a fugitive from Eric's justice. My father still owes a debt that can only be paid with my marriage. Nothing has changed except the location of my hiding place." "Everything has changed," Stigvar corrected gently. 3 days ago you were alone, defenseless, with no knowledge of survival in winter wilderness. Now you have an ally who knows these forests like a spider knows its web. More importantly, you have proven to yourself that you can endure hardship and make difficult decisions under pressure." He leaned forward, his grey eyes intense. "I have been thinking about your situation, and I believe there is a path forward that serves both justice and survival. But it requires you to become someone different than the farm girl who fled into these woods." "Different how?" Brynja asked. though something in his tone made her pulse quicken with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Eric's power comes from people's fear of him and their belief that resistance is futile, Stigvar explained. He rules through the assumption that those who oppose him will be crushed swiftly and publicly. But what if that assumption proved false? What if his enemies began to disappear rather than surrender? The implications of his words slowly dawned on her. You are talking about war against the Chieftain, about killing his men and disrupting his operations. I'm talking about giving you the tools to reclaim your life on your own terms, Stigvar said. Eric has many enemies who lack the courage or skill to act against him effectively. A few successful strikes against his interests might inspire others to similar action. Brynja shook her head, overwhelmed by the scope of what he was suggesting. I am not a warrior. I know nothing of weapons or tactics or— You know more than you realize, Stigvar interrupted. You have already demonstrated the most important qualities of a successful fighter, the ability to think clearly under pressure, the will to endure hardship for a worthy goal, and the courage to act when action seems impossible. He gestured toward her mother's knife at her belt. The rest can be taught. The conversation continued through the morning as they prepared to leave the lodge. Stigvar moved through the space methodically, gathering supplies and concealing evidence of their presence with the thoroughness of someone who had learned to leave no traces behind. He showed Brynja how to bank the fire so that it would die slowly, how to arrange the furniture to suggest the lodge had remained empty, how to step in his footprints to avoid creating a clear trail. Where did you learn such skills? She asked as they worked. From necessity, he replied. A berserker who wishes to disappear must become very good at not being found. The same techniques that served my exile can serve our purposes now. As they prepared to venture back into the winter forest, Brynja found herself studying Stigvar with new eyes. Over the past 3 days, she had seen him as protector and host, the strange hermit who had saved her from Eric's hunter. Now she began to recognize the strategic mind that had once led warband raids, the tactical expertise that had kept him alive through countless battles. You have been planning this since you found me, she realized. All those questions about my father's debt, about Eric's methods, you were gathering intelligence for a campaign. Stigvar paused in his packing to look at her directly. I was considering possibilities, he admitted. 7 years of solitude teaches a man to think before acting, to examine problems from every angle before committing to solutions. Your situation presented an interesting challenge, and the solution involves turning me into what? A guerrilla fighter hiding in the wilderness? The solution involves giving you enough power to negotiate from a position of strength, Stigvar corrected. Right now, Eric holds all the advantages. He has wealth, armed men, social position, legal authority to enforce the debt your father signed. You have nothing except your determination to remain free. He shouldered his pack, the movement casual, despite the obvious weight of supplies and weapons concealed within. I propose to change that balance. By spring, I intend to ensure that Eric Grimson understands that claiming you as payment will cost more than any debt is worth. The plan he outlined as they prepared to leave. The lodge was audacious in its scope and terrifying in its implications. Rather than simply hiding from Eric's forces, they would actively work to undermine the chieftain's authority through carefully targeted strikes against his property and supporters. Stigvar's knowledge of the local geography would allow them to move unseen through territories that Eric's men knew only as roads and settlements. It will be dangerous, Stigvar warned as they stood ready to depart. Eric will not tolerate open defiance without responding with overwhelming force. Once we begin this path, there will be no possibility of negotiation or surrender. Brynja looked around the lodge one final time, memorizing the space that had sheltered her transformation from desperate fugitive to something approaching hope. Then she turned to face the forest and the uncertain future it represented. Then we must ensure that we succeed, she said simply. 2 weeks later, Brynja crouched in the snow beside Stigvar, watching Eric's tax collector make his rounds through the village of Thorndale. From their position on the wooded hillside, they could observe the entire settlement, a dozen modest farmsteads clustered around a small wooden hall where the local headman conducted business under the chieftain's authority. Hakon moved from door to door with his customary arrogance, flanked by two armed guards who seemed more interested in intimidating the villagers than protecting their master. At each stop, he demanded payment in grain, livestock, or coin, consulting a scroll that detailed every family's obligations to their distant overlord. "Third farm from the left," Stigvar murmured, pointing toward a modest homestead where an elderly woman emerged to meet Hakon's party. Widow Sigrid. Her husband died in last summer's harvest accident, but Eric still demands full payment as if nothing had changed. Brynja watched as the tax collector gestured dismissively at whatever plea the woman offered. One of his guards stepped forward, hand resting on his sword hilt in clear threat. The widow disappeared into her cottage and returned with a small leather pouch that she handed over with obvious reluctance. "Her winter stores," Stigvar continued. "Enough grain to see her through the worst months. Now she will have to beg charity from neighbors who can barely feed themselves, or starve quietly where Eric need not concern himself with her fate." The scene played out with depressing familiarity at each cottage. Fear, desperation, and grudging compliance as families handed over the fruits of their labor to a man who produced nothing but misery. Brynja felt her anger building with each transaction, remembering her own father's shame at signing away his daughter to settle similar demands. "Why do they submit?" she asked quietly. 20 families against 3 men. They could overwhelm Hakon easily enough and face Eirik's retaliation, Stigvar replied. He would burn every farm and crucify every man who resisted, making certain that neighboring villages understood the cost of defiance. Better to lose half your harvest than lose everything, including your life. They watched until Hakon completed his circuit and departed with his guards and a heavily loaded wagon of tribute. Only then did they make their way down the hillside toward the concealed camp where they had established their base of operations. The camp itself reflected Stigvar's meticulous planning, a series of lean-to shelters built into a natural depression and covered with brush and snow for camouflage. A small fire pit, lined with stones and shielded by carefully arranged deadfall, provided warmth without producing telltale smoke. Everything could be dismantled and moved within an hour if circumstances required. "Your training continues tonight," Stigvar announced as they settled beside the fire. Over the past weeks, he had been methodically teaching Brynja the skills she would need for their campaign. Weapons work with knife and hatchet, moving silently through winter forest, reading tracks and signs that betrayed human passage. More importantly, he had been training her mind for violence, helping her understand the difference between killing in rage and killing with purpose. The transformation had not been easy. Brynja's hands, accustomed to healing herbs and birthing animals, had struggled to adapt to the weight and balance of combat blades. Her feet, trained for farm work and domestic tasks, had needed time to learn the careful placement required for silent stalking. Most difficult of all, her heart had required conditioning to accept that some people deserved death more than mercy. "Tonight we move against the grain wagons," Stigvar continued, producing a hand-drawn map from his pack. "Hakon will spend the evening drinking at the hall before beginning his return journey tomorrow. His guards will be drunk and careless, and the wagon will be heavy enough to slow their progress through the forest pass." He traced the route with one scarred finger, showing the narrow defile where the old road wound between 2 steep hillsides. "We take position here before dawn. When they enter the pass, we drop trees across both ends, trap them in the killing ground with nowhere to run." Brynja studied the terrain carefully, noting the sightlines and escape routes that would determine success or failure. "The guards will not surrender. They know what Eirik does to men who lose his property. Then they will die," Stigvar said matter-of-factly. 3 lives against the welfare of an entire village seems acceptable mathematics. The clinical way he discussed killing still unsettled Brynja, though she had learned not to show her discomfort. Stigvar had explained that successful warriors learn to separate emotion from necessity, to see death as a tool like any other when properly applied. "What of Hakon himself?" she asked. "Hakon presents a more complex problem," Stigvar admitted. "Killing him would send a clear message about the cost of serving Eric's interests. But it would also guarantee massive retaliation against any village suspected of harboring us. Better to let him live with the knowledge that his master's authority can be challenged successfully." They spent the evening preparing for the ambush, checking weapons and reviewing contingency plans for various complications. Stigvar had taught Brynja that survival depended on anticipating everything that could go wrong and having responses ready before they became necessary. "You have changed," he observed as they worked. "The frightened girl who fled into the forest has become someone harder, more focused. Your mother would be proud of the woman you are becoming." "Would she?" Brynja asked, testing the edge of her hatchet against a piece of leather. "I think she hoped I would use her teachings to heal people, not to plan their deaths. Sometimes healing requires cutting away diseased flesh," Stigvar replied. "Eric and his servants are a sickness that spreads suffering wherever they go. Removing them from the world serves the same purpose as any other medicine. It allows healthy things to grow." The comparison helped, though Brynja suspected it would be some time before killing felt as natural as the healing work her mother had taught her. She had discovered that she possessed the steady nerves and clear thinking necessary for violence, but her conscience still demanded justification for each life she might take. As they prepared for sleep, Stigvar handed her a small wooden carving he had been working on during quiet moments in camp. It depicted a raven in flight, wings spread and eyes alert, carved with the same careful attention he brought to all his crafts. "What does it mean?" Brynja asked, examining the intricate details. "Ravens are Odin's messengers," Stigvar explained. "They carry word between the world of men and the realm of the gods. But they are also scavengers who feed on the aftermath of battle." He met her eyes in the firelight. "Like us, they serve both death and wisdom, depending on what the situation requires." Brynja tucked the carving into her belt pouch, understanding that it represented more than mere decoration. It was recognition of her transformation, acknowledgement that she had earned a place in the dangerous work they had chosen. Tomorrow they would spill blood in service of justice, and she would discover whether her new hardness extended to watching men die by her own hand. The ambush unfolded exactly as Stigvar had planned. 2 massive pines fell across the narrow pass at precisely the right moment, trapping Hakon's wagon between walls of stone and timber. The tax collector's guards died quickly, one from Brynja's hatchet as he tried to scramble over the deadfall, the other from Stigvar's silent approach through the morning mist. Hakon himself cowered beside his overturned wagon, watching in terror as they distributed grain back to leather pouches marked with family names. "Tell your master," Stigvar said as they prepared to disappear back into the forest, "that some debts carry interest rates he cannot afford to pay." But as they melted into the tree line, Brynja caught sight of something that made her blood freeze. A 4th horse stood tethered among the trees, its rider watching their retreat through narrowed eyes. The man wore no colors or insignia, but something about his bearing suggested military training and careful observation. "We were seen," she whispered urgently to Stigvar once they had put distance between themselves and the pass. "I know," he replied grimly. "The question is by whom and what they intend to do with the information." They found out 3 days later when a lone figure approached their camp under a white banner tied to a long branch. The man was perhaps 40 years old, lean and weathered, with the kind of scars that spoke of serious fighting rather than mere brawling. Most tellingly, he moved through the winter forest with the confident stride of someone equally at home in wilderness and war. "I come seeking the Wolf of Thorndale," he called out when he reached speaking distance. "I bring word from those who share his enemies." Stigvar emerged from concealment with his massive sword in hand, though he held it loosely rather than in obvious threat. "You have found him. Speak your piece before I decide whether you leave here alive." "My name is Eric Bloodaxe," the stranger replied, and Brynja felt Stigvar stiffen beside her at the introduction. "I served as captain of Eirik, Grimson's household guard until 3 days ago, when I learned something that changed my understanding of my master's character, and what revelation could turn the chieftain's most trusted warrior against him?" Stigvar asked skeptically. Eric reached slowly into his pack and withdrew a leather folder bound with iron wire. Correspondence between Eirik and Jarls in 3 neighboring territories. Letters that detail a plan to unite the region under his rule through a combination of strategic marriages, assassinations, and manufactured conflicts designed to eliminate potential rivals. He held out the folder with steady hands. "Your lady there was never intended to be simply another wife. According to these documents, Eirik plans to use her as bait to draw out anyone foolish enough to champion her cause. Once he has identified and eliminated such resistance, he intends to expand his territory by claiming that neighboring chiefs failed to control bandits operating from their lands." Brynja felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "You mean he wanted you to escape?" Eric continued grimly. "Wanted someone to come forward as your protector so he could justify wider military action. Every village that suffers from his retaliation, every farm that burns in response to your rebellion, it all serves his larger goal of destabilizing the region until only he remains strong enough to restore order." Stigvar's knuckles whitened on his sword grip, but his voice remained level. "Why should we believe you? You could be Eric's agent, sent to spread confusion and discord among his enemies, because 3 nights ago I discovered the fate he has planned for his own men once the campaign is complete," Eric replied. "Those who know too much about his methods will suffer convenient accidents or be assigned to suicide missions against impossible odds. My own name appears on a list marked for elimination once my usefulness ends." He gestured toward the folder again. "Everything is documented there, names, dates, detailed plans for provocations designed to justify his expansion, including orders for my own death disguised as heroic sacrifice in battle." Brynja moved to examine the documents, her mother's teaching allowing her to puzzle out the formal language of official correspondence. What she read made her stomach turn with a mixture of rage and despair. Eric spoke the truth. Her rebellion had been anticipated, even encouraged, through carefully managed incompetence among Eirik's search parties. "He let us escape the lodge," she realized with growing horror. "The warrior you killed, he was meant to fail, to drive us further from civilization, where we would be more dependent on violence to survive, and more likely to escalate our resistance in ways that would justify brutal retaliation against innocent villages," Stigvar added, understanding dawning in his grey eyes. "We have been dancing to his tune from the beginning," Eric nodded grimly. "The grain you returned to Thorndale? It will be reclaimed within days, along with double penalties for harboring bandits. The families you thought to help will suffer worse than if you had never acted at all." The magnitude of their manipulations slowly sank in. Every choice that had seemed like defiance had actually served Eirik's broader strategy. Their rebellion had not been an act of freedom, but another form of slavery. Their supposed independence merely a longer leash designed to let them hang themselves more thoroughly. "What do you propose?" Stigvar asked finally. "I propose we give Eirik Grimson exactly what he wants," Eric replied with a predatory smile. "He desires chaos and conflict to justify his expansion. Then let us provide chaos on such a scale that it devours his plans instead of serving them." He spread a larger map on the ground between them, marking positions with small stones as he spoke. 20 of my former subordinates share my disgust with Eirik's methods and my concern for their own survival. Each commands the loyalty of additional warriors who joined our service, believing they fought for honor rather than ambition. The plan Eric outlined was breathtaking in its audacity. Rather than continuing their small-scale harassment of Eirik's operations, They would coordinate a simultaneous uprising across multiple territories. Every village that had suffered under the chieftain's rule would rise at once, supported by insider knowledge from Eric's network of disaffected warriors. The beauty of the strategy lies in its timing, Eric explained. Eric has positioned his forces for expansion, not defense of his existing territory. His best warriors are staged at forward positions, preparing to exploit the chaos your rebellion was meant to create. When that chaos erupts in his rear instead of his front, he will find himself fighting a war on multiple fronts with insufficient reserves. And if we fail? Brynja asked. If we fail, we die quickly instead of slowly, Eric replied matter-of-factly. But if we succeed, we destroy not just Eric's plans for expansion, but his ability to hold what he already controls. The surrounding Jarls will recognize the weakness and move to claim their shares of his territory. Stigvar studied the map carefully, his tactical mind evaluating distances and timing requirements. It could work, he admitted finally, but it requires perfect coordination and absolute commitment from people who have learned to distrust bold promises, which is why it needs the Wolf of Thorndale to succeed, Eric said, meeting his eyes directly. Your reputation for keeping faith with allies and destroying enemies has spread further than you know. The people who would follow you into this venture need to believe that someone with your reputation for honor stands behind the plan, as the three of them worked through the evening refining strategy and identifying potential allies. Brynja found herself grappling with the implications of Eric's revelation. Her flight into the forest had not been an act of defiance, but an unwitting participation in Eric's larger scheme. Every choice she had thought was hers had actually been guided by his manipulations. But perhaps that very manipulation could become the weapon that destroyed him. If Eric expected rebellion on his terms, they would give him revolution on their own. The War Council convened in the abandoned mine shafts beneath Raven's Hollow, a settlement that had died when Eric's taxes made iron extraction unprofitable. 23 men and women gathered in the lamp-lit darkness, representatives of villages and warrior bands who had suffered under the chieftain's expanding ambitions. The air smelled of cold stone and old fear, but also of something else. The electric tension that preceded great undertakings. Stigvar stood before a crude table where maps and message scrolls covered every available surface. Beside him, Eric Bloodaxe pointed out strategic positions, while Brynja organized the coded messages that had arrived throughout the week. Each represented a commitment from communities ready to risk everything on a single coordinated strike against Eric's authority. The timing cannot be changed, Stigvar addressed the assembled leaders. Tomorrow is market day in Eric's hall. His personal guard will be reduced by half, while they escort tax wagons to the regional assembly. His remaining warriors will be spread thin, protecting the tribute convoy and maintaining order among crowds that have grown increasingly restless. Gunhild Ironsmith, representative of the displaced metalworkers, raised a weathered hand. My people are skilled in fire and metalwork, not warfare. How do you expect us to fight trained soldiers? You do not fight them, Eric replied. You destroy their supplies, their communications, their ability to coordinate responses. While warriors engage Eric's guards directly, your people ensure that reinforcements cannot reach the battle and surviving enemies cannot call for help. The plan they had developed over weeks of careful preparation was complex, but elegant in its essential simplicity. Rather than attempting to assault Eric's stronghold directly, they would isolate it by simultaneously severing every line of communication and supply that connected the chieftain to his scattered territories. Brynja spread a detailed map across the table, marking positions with colored stones. Red stones mark Eric's guard posts, watchtowers and patrol stations that must be eliminated to prevent warnings from reaching the main hall. Blue stones show supply depots where his forces store food, weapons, and replacement equipment. Green stones indicate villages whose headmen have secretly pledged support for the uprising. The coordination required was staggering. Signal fires would need to be lit at precisely timed intervals to ensure simultaneous action across dozens of locations. Messenger ravens, trained by sympathetic farmers, would carry confirmation codes between widely separated resistance cells. Most critically, Eric's network of infiltrators within Eric's own forces would need to choose their moment of betrayal with perfect precision. "What of the chieftain himself?" asked Magnus Beardbreaker, whose logging camp had been burned for refusing to provide free timber. "All our planning comes to nothing if Eric escapes to rally loyal forces from neighboring territories. Eric will be in his great hall, presiding over market day proceedings," Stigvar replied. "Standard protocol requires him to remain visible to petitioners and merchants throughout the daylight hours. He considers the ritual a demonstration of his authority and accessibility." Eric nodded grimly. "Which means he will be trapped in his own stronghold when we bring that authority crashing down around him. My former subordinates know every secret passage and weak point in the hall's defenses. When the outer perimeter falls, we will have him cornered like a rat in a granary." As the evening progressed, each resistance cell received detailed instructions for their specific objectives. Some would disable guard posts through stealth and surprise. Others would seize supply depots and distribute weapons to villagers ready to join the fight. The most dangerous assignments, direct assault on fortified positions, were reserved for Eric's warriors and volunteers with combat experience. Brynja found herself assigned to what Eric called the information war, coordinating communications between scattered forces and ensuring that accurate intelligence reached commanders who needed it. The responsibility felt enormous, but her weeks of training with Stigvar had taught her to process complex tactical situations under pressure. "Are you ready for this?" Stigvar asked quietly as the council dispersed to make final preparations. His grey eyes searched her face, looking for signs of doubt or fear that might compromise her effectiveness when lives depended on clear thinking. "I am ready to see Eric face consequences for his actions," Brynja replied, surprised by the steel in her own voice. "Everything he has done, to my family, to these people, to the warriors who trusted him, demands an accounting." They spent the final hours before dawn reviewing contingency plans and emergency signals. Each leader carried a small horn carved with distinctive patterns, allowing them to communicate basic messages across battlefield distances, even when visual contact was impossible. Backup rendezvous points had been established in case primary positions were compromised. Most importantly, clear success and failure. Criteria had been defined so that commanders could make independent decisions. If communication broke down entirely, Eric produced a leather satchel containing what he called Eric's final insurance, additional documents proving the chieftain's complicity in slave trading operations that violated agreements with neighboring jarls. If he somehow survives the initial assault, these papers will ensure that no allied territory offers him sanctuary. His political isolation will be complete. As the first pale light of dawn touched the eastern horizon, Brynja made her final preparations with hands that remained remarkably steady despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. She secured her weapons, the hatchet that had tasted blood at the grain wagon ambush, her mother's knife that had become a symbol of inherited courage, and a short sword that Eric had provided for close combat situations. The raven carving Stigvar had given her weeks earlier found its place in a small pouch at her belt, alongside dried herbs that her mother had taught her to use for treating wounds. The combination felt appropriate, symbols of both healing and destruction, representing the dual nature of the work they had chosen. "Remember," Stigvar said, as they prepared to separate for their individual missions, "success requires that each person accomplish their specific objective, nothing more and nothing less. Do not attempt heroics beyond your assignment. Do not try to rescue others if your own position becomes untenable. The revolution succeeds only if enough pieces of the plan work correctly." His words carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Brynja understood that he was thinking of the boy he had failed to save years ago, of the consequences that flowed from good intentions poorly executed. This time, their planning accounted for human nature as carefully as it addressed tactical necessities. The final moment of departure felt strangely anticlimactic after weeks of preparation. No speeches, no ceremonies, no dramatic farewells, just a collection of determined people walking quietly into the grey morning light to attempt something that would either transform their world or destroy them entirely. Brynja made her way to the observation post that would serve as her command station, a natural rock formation that provided sightlines to key positions while remaining hidden from casual observation. From here, she would coordinate the flow of information that would allow scattered forces to function as a unified whole. As she settled into position and tested her signal equipment one final time, she found herself thinking not of the violence to come, but of the morning weeks ago when she had fled her father's farm in desperate flight. That frightened girl seemed like a stranger now, someone who had believed that running away was her only choice, who could not imagine fighting back against forces that seemed overwhelmingly powerful. The transformation felt complete. As she watched the sun rise over a landscape where dozens of resistance cells waited for her signal to begin their coordinated assault on Eric's authority. Today would determine whether justice was possible in a world ruled by fear and debt, or whether power would always triumph over principle. The silver armband that had started this entire conflict, Eric's symbol of ownership and control, would be answered at last by the courage of those who refused to remain his property. Whatever the outcome, they would face it as free people who had chosen their own path, rather than accepting the one imposed on them by others' ambitions. The first signal horn sounded at the moment the sun cleared the tree line, its deep note rolling across the valley like distant thunder. From her observation post, Brynja watched smoke begin to rise from guard towers along the perimeter of Eric's territory as resistance fighters overwhelmed isolated sentries with swift, coordinated strikes. The beauty of their plan lay in its simultaneity. Before any single guard post could raise an alarm, all of them were already under attack. Signal fires that should have warned of trouble instead carried messages between rebel forces, their coded meanings known only to those who had planned this uprising for weeks. Through her bronze-rimmed lens, a gift from Eric's personal collection, Brynja could observe the main hall where Eric conducted his market day proceedings. The chieftain sat on his ornate chair beneath banners displaying his personal insignia, apparently unaware that his outer defenses were crumbling like rotten timber. Merchants and petitioners crowded the courtyard before him, their morning business proceeding with normal routine. But something was wrong. The crowd seemed larger than usual, and its composition struck Brynja as odd. Too many young men of fighting age, too few of the elderly farmers and craftsmen who typically dominated market gatherings. She raised her signal horn to warn of potential complications, but before she could sound the alert, events took a turn that changed everything. The merchant nearest Eric's throne suddenly straightened from his subservient posture and threw back his traveling cloak to reveal Eric Bloodaxe in full battle gear. The signal for the final phase had come earlier than planned, but Eric's timing proved flawless as chaos erupted throughout the courtyard. What Brynja had mistaken for an unusually large crowd revealed itself as a carefully positioned strike force. Dozens of fighters threw off their disguises and drew weapons, surrounding Eric's personal guards before they could react effectively. The chieftain's throne room became a trap of steel and fury as his most trusted warriors found themselves facing former comrades who had turned against their oath of loyalty from the watchtowers. Around the hall's perimeter, Eric's infiltrators eliminated sentries and seized control of defensive positions. The horn calls that should have summoned reinforcements instead signaled the success of each stage in the perfectly orchestrated assault. But Eric himself proved more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Rather than cowering in the face of betrayal, The chieftain rose from his throne, with sword already in hand, his face transformed by a cold fury that reminded everyone present why he had risen to power through violence and cunning. "You think to take what is mine," he roared, his voice carrying across the courtyard despite the clash of weapons around him. "I am Eric Grimson. I have bathed in the blood of better men than you." The chieftain's personal fighting ability had been underestimated by those who knew him primarily as a politician and administrator. In the space of heartbeats, 2 rebel fighters lay dead at his feet, their blood staining the stones where petitioners had knelt to beg his mercy. Eric himself stepped forward to meet the chieftain in single combat, understanding that their revolution could not succeed while its primary enemy remained alive and defiant. What followed was less a duel than a demonstration of why Eric had earned his position as captain of guards. His swordwork combined technical precision with brutal efficiency, each strike designed to end the fight as quickly as possible. But Eric fought with the desperate fury of a man who understood that defeat meant not just death but the complete destruction of everything he had built. The courtyard battle raged while Brynja coordinated signals from resistance cells across the territory. Success reports arrived in steady succession. Supply depots seized, communication lines severed, loyal forces isolated and overwhelmed by superior numbers and insider knowledge. The revolution was proceeding exactly as planned in every location, except the one that mattered most. Through her lens, she watched Eric and Eric trade killing strokes beside the ornate throne that had symbolized absolute authority over the region. Both men bled from multiple wounds, their movements beginning to slow as exhaustion and blood loss took their toll. Around them, the larger battle had devolved into a series of smaller conflicts as Eric's remaining guards fought desperate rearguard actions against overwhelming odds. Stigvar's voice reached her through the battle noise, shouting orders to resistance fighters who had secured the hall's main gate. He moved through the combat with the terrible efficiency she had witnessed at the hunting lodge, his massive sword cutting down anyone foolish enough to challenge the Wolf of Thorndale directly. But even as victory seemed within reach, Brynja spotted movement that sent ice through her veins. A second force was approaching the hall from the eastern approach, 20 mounted warriors in Eric's colors, apparently returning from some mission that had taken them beyond the reach of the initial strikes. The reinforcements would arrive within minutes, potentially turning the tide just as the revolution reached its climax. Brynja raised her horn to signal the approaching threat, but realized with growing horror that most resistance fighters were too engaged in close combat to respond to tactical warnings. Brynja abandoned her observation post without hesitation, racing through the forest toward the eastern approach, where Eric's reinforcements would soon reach the hall. Her mind calculated distances and timing with the clarity that weeks of training had instilled. She could intercept the mounted warriors at the narrow bridge where the old Roman road crossed Thornbrook, but only if she moved faster than seemed humanly possible. Behind her, the sounds of battle continued to echo from the courtyard where Eric and Eric still fought their deadly duel. Every clash of steel reminded her that the revolution's success balanced on the edge of a sword, and that failure would mean death for everyone who had dared to challenge the chieftain's authority. The bridge came into view just as the first of Eric's warriors emerged from the tree line. 20 mounted men in full battle gear, their weapons ready and their faces grim, with the understanding that something had gone terribly wrong at their lord's stronghold. They approached the crossing with the confidence of professional soldiers who had never known defeat. From her concealed position beside the bridge's stone supports, Brynja could hear their leader issuing orders with crisp military precision. "Olaf, take 5 men and circle to the south entrance. Magnus, secure the stables and prevent any escape attempts. The rest of you, follow me through the main gate. We retake the hall and execute every rebel we find." The plan would work perfectly if allowed to proceed. Eric's guards were disciplined fighters who understood urban combat, and their arrival would trap the resistance forces between hammer and anvil. But Brynja had learned something important during her weeks with Stigvar. Sometimes a single person in the right place could change the course of entire battles. The bridge itself was ancient stonework, Roman engineering that had survived centuries of weather and warfare. But time and neglect had weakened the mortar between its massive blocks, and recent floods had undermined the eastern foundation. Brynja had noticed these details during earlier reconnaissance, filing them away as potentially useful information. Now she put her mother's knife to work in an entirely different kind of healing, cutting away the rotten timber supports that held the bridge's damaged eastern span in place. The work required careful precision to avoid premature collapse that might warn the approaching warriors. But desperation lent strength to her hands as she severed beam after beam. The first riders were already on the bridge when she cut through the final support. The ancient stone groaned once, like a dying giant drawing its last breath, then simply disappeared into the rushing waters below. 7 warriors and their mounts vanished in an instant, swept away by the spring flood that had seemed like mere scenic backdrop moments earlier. The remaining 13 riders found themselves stranded on the western bank, their direct route to the hall blocked by 30 feet of empty air and churning water. Their leader cursed with creative profanity while evaluating alternative approaches, all of which would require significant detours through difficult terrain. But Brynja was not finished. From the leather pouch at her belt, she retrieved the brass mirror that had belonged to her mother, a tool used for examining throats and wounds that now served an entirely different purpose. The morning sun, reflected and focused through the polished metal, created a brilliant flash of light that could be seen for miles. The signal brought immediate response from resistance fighters positioned throughout the surrounding hills. Dozens of fighters emerged from concealment, surrounding the stranded warriors with a ring of ready weapons. The reinforcements who had come to save their chieftain found themselves facing the same hopeless odds that now engulfed Eirik's stronghold. "Surrender!" Brynja called out as she emerged from her hiding place, her voice carrying clearly across the water. "Your lord's reign has ended. You can die defending a cause that no longer exists, or you can live to serve better masters." The enemy commander studied the forces arrayed against him with professional assessment, weighing honor against survival in calculations that every experienced warrior eventually faced. His men looked to him for guidance, their training warring against the evidence of their own eyes. From the direction of the hall, a new sound reached them, the horn call that signified ultimate victory or defeat. 3 long blasts, repeated twice, in the pattern that Eirik had designated for either complete success or total failure. The waiting stretched like drawn wire until a messenger arrived at full gallop, his horse lathered with sweat and his face bright with triumph. "Eirik is dead!" he shouted as soon as he came within voice range. Eirik Bloodaxe stands victorious in the throne room, and the chieftain's guards have laid down their arms. The stranded reinforcements received this news with varying reactions. Some cursed their timing, others seemed almost relieved that the decision had been taken from them. Their commander remained silent for a long moment, then deliberately sheathed his sword in a gesture that his men immediately understood and copied. "We yield to the new order," he said formally. "May it prove more just than the one we served." The revolution was complete, but Brynja found herself thinking not of victory, but of the bridge that now lay broken in the waters below. Some structures, no matter how ancient or impressive, could not survive the changes that time and necessity demanded. 3 months after the revolution, Brynja stood in the doorway of her father's cottage, watching him tend the small garden where her mother's healing herbs had once grown in careful rows. His movements carried purpose again, the defeated slump gone from his shoulders as he worked soil that belonged to him rather than to creditors and cruel lords. The transformation of their world had not happened overnight. After Eirik's death, it had taken weeks of careful negotiation to establish new governance that would prevent another tyrant from filling the power vacuum. Eirik Bloodaxe had surprised everyone by refusing the chieftain's throne. insisting instead on a council structure that distributed authority among representatives from each village and trade group. Leadership should serve the people, not rule them, he had declared during the assembly that formalized the new arrangements. We fought to end tyranny, not to replace one tyrant with another. The decision had proven wise. Without a single powerful figure to target, neighboring jarls found it difficult to justify intervention in what they were forced to acknowledge as legitimate political reform. More importantly, the dispersed leadership structure made corruption and abuse more difficult to conceal or coordinate. Brynja's own role in the new order remained deliberately undefined. Some called her the Wolf's Maiden, others preferred Lady of the Broken Bridge, but she had declined all formal titles or official positions. Instead, she had chosen to travel between settlements, carrying messages and helping resolve disputes with the diplomatic skills her mother had taught her alongside herbal lore. You could have anything you wanted, Stigvar had observed during one of their conversations in the weeks following the victory. Lands, titles, wealth, the council would grant whatever you requested. What I wanted was the freedom to choose my own path, Brynja had replied. Everything else is just decoration. Now, standing in the familiar surroundings of her childhood home, she reflected on how much had changed while so much remained constant. Her father still rose before dawn to tend his animals. The cottage still smelled of wood smoke and simple cooking. The view from the doorway still showed the same rolling hills and distant forest where her desperate flight had begun, but the fear was gone. Children played in yards without watching nervously for tax collectors. Merchants traveled the roads without armed escorts. Farmers planned their harvests based on family needs rather than tribute obligations. "Will you stay for the harvest festival?" Gunnar asked as he joined her in the doorway, wiping dirt from his hands with a cloth that his wife had embroidered years ago. The question carried layers of meaning. When would she settle down? When would she choose stability over the wandering life that had claimed her since the revolution? "For a few days," Brynja replied, understanding both the question and its subtext. "Then Stigvar and I leave for the northern territories. They have troubles with raiders from across the sea, and the new settlements need someone who understands both warfare and diplomacy." Her father nodded without surprise. He had grown used to his daughter's absences, just as he had learned to be proud of the woman she had become, rather than mourn the peaceful life she might have lived under different circumstances. "Your mother would be proud," he said quietly. "She always said you had the gift for healing, but I think she knew it would take forms she could not predict." Stigvar appeared on the path from the village, his massive frame unmistakable even at distance. He moved with the same careful grace that had characterized him since their first meeting at the hunting lodge, but something in his bearing had changed. The weight of old guilt no longer bent his shoulders, though he remained the same thoughtful man who preferred solitude to crowds. Their partnership had evolved in the months since the revolution. More than allies, less than lovers, they had found a comfortable balance that honored both their shared mission and their individual natures. They worked together with the efficiency born of complete trust, each understanding their role in the larger pattern of their calling. "The northern chiefs have sent word," Stigvar announced as he reached the cottage. "They accept our offer of assistance, but they warn that the sea raiders are better organized than usual this season. Professional fighters rather than desperate farmers seeking easy plunder. Then they will require a professional response," Brynja replied matter-of-factly. The prospect of new dangers no longer frightened her as it once had. She had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. As evening approached, they sat around the cottage hearth, sharing a meal that reminded Brynja of countless similar evenings throughout her childhood. But the conversation had changed. Instead of worrying about failed harvests and unpayable debts, her father spoke of plans for expanding his herb garden and possibly acquiring additional land from neighbors who wanted to try different crops. The silver armband that had once represented Eric's power over their lives now served as a paperweight on her father's writing table. holding down deed papers that confirmed his ownership of land his family had worked for generations. The symbol of bondage had become a reminder of freedom earned through courage and sacrifice. When the time came for farewells, they were briefer than in the old days, when departure might mean permanent separation. The new roads were safer, messages traveled more reliably, and the world had grown smaller through the elimination of artificial barriers erected by tyrants and their supporters. "Send word when you can," Gunnar requested as he embraced his daughter at the cottage gate. "Not because I worry, I know you can handle whatever troubles you encounter, but because your old father likes to hear stories of the good work you do in the world." As they walked toward the forest where their horses waited, Brynja felt the familiar excitement that preceded new adventures and unknown challenges. Behind her lay the security of home and family. Ahead stretched the endless possibilities that belonged to those who had chosen to write their own stories rather than accept the endings imposed by others. The revolution had given her people freedom from tyranny. Now she would help others claim the same gift, one village and one choice at a time.